Welcome everyone to the sixth week of the Kamoinge workshop, a virtual symposium, collaboration, community, and photography. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the adult programs coordinator, and I just wanted to give a brief overview of how tonight will work. We will be hearing from our first presenter, Sharia L. Cochran, who will give a 30-minute talk. And then we'll transition to our artist discussion between Adger Cowens and Dr. Arina Dugan, one of the catalog essayists. So I am going to turn it over to our first presenter, Sharia L. Cochran. So we will be hearing from the former research assistant for the Lewis H. Draper Archive about Draper's sense of place. We'll follow that presentation with a discussion between the artist Adger Cowens and catalog essayist Dr. Arina Dugan, who will discuss street photography. Sharia L. Cochran is a pre-doctoral fellow and PhD student in the art history program at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Cochran's research focuses on cross-cultural photography and photojournalism during the 20th century. She received her MA from Virginia Commonwealth University, where she has also taught the history of photography as an adjunct instructor. Sharia, we are delighted to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Izzy. Thanks to you for coordinating with all the technology, and to Sarah for the invitation. Working on this project has just been a tremendous joy. So I'm really excited to share some of the things that maybe didn't quite make it into the exhibition catalog, but definitely informed some of mine and Sarah's thinking as we went through Lewis Draper's archive. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to kind of give some attention to the process that we went through. Because when you're looking through an archive, trying to, well, for me specifically, I was really trying to put together the chronology for the catalog. So I was really interested in where Lewis Draper was working and when he was in those places, like what year was it? So I thought I'd walk everyone through a little bit of that process and some of the really interesting items that we were able to locate. So when we were looking in the archive, one of the things that I found most fascinating was the variety of photographer stamps that were on the back of prints, because we could kind of see how Draper was moving throughout the city by the address. And so some of those prints did not have dates that were notated on them. We actually had to triangulate when he was living or working at these addresses. So first thing I did was compile as many of the addresses that I could. Some of them came from resumes. A lot of them came from the backs of photographs. And so between where he was working, where he was living, we kind of were able to put all these little dots on a map. And there's no way that I'll be able to go through all of these dots, but I can hit a few of the high points between 1957 when he arrives in New York, and then 1961 when we see him working in Eugene Smith's studio and loft. So in thinking about looking at the backs of photographs, we found some things to be very, very helpful, especially when we could see more than one address. So on this back of this photograph here, we have one address that has been crossed out. So we have the 24 West. Sorry, excuse me, I'm trying to adjust my screen so I can see a little bit better. So we have this one address that's been cut out or crossed out and then replaced with another address. And so then we know that he lived somewhere first and then he moved. And then luckily on this photograph, we have a September 1962 date, which is incredibly helpful. So this particular photograph, which is untitled, is in the archive. And you can see the 240 West 10th Street, New York address. And this one was really interesting to work with because it shows up in several different places in the archive. So as I was going through Draper's many collection, like many negatives and contact sheets, one of the contact sheets I was able to find was this one of a gallery show. You can see in the bottom, I think the bottom three lines of negatives, what appears to be a gallery show that's being hung. And so I was able to see this photo here on the left actually hung in the gallery. And then when we are looking at the notations that Draper was able to leave on these negative sleeves, we see here, if you look at the top here, he's noted that it's his first exhibit at Grove Street Gallery in 1958. I'm not really sure if this is his first exhibition at the gallery or if it is his first exhibition ever. We're not really sure, but it does give us a sense that this photograph, though it's not been dated, is really early. And so at 1958, we can then put 2 and 2 together. And so through the process of comparing contact sheets, resumes, addresses, all of these different pieces of information, we were then able to attach some dates to some of these addresses. So I'll point out 2 that will kind of reoccur. One is this 240 West 10th Street that we've already looked at. And then this 20 East 127th Street, which is Lou Draper's address at Langston Hughes Brownstone, where he rented a second floor apartment. And so I mentioned resumes being really helpful, and this was a really great chance for us to evaluate how Draper noted his own work and kind of indicated for us where he was and when he was working where. So you can kind of see here he's laid out his education for us, and then he's conveniently noted that he had private workshop study with Harold Feinstein, and then also private workshop study with Eugene Smith. So we have all these pieces of information and documents that we're using. So I'm going to go through a little bit of his early years and kind of identifying where he was. So we know that in 1957, Draper arrives in New York and he is renting a room at the William Sloan House YMCA. Here's a great kind of vintage postcard of that building in Midtown Manhattan. And then he moves to the Upper West Side. So we have one of his earliest addresses in 1958 at 333 West 87th Street, but we have a lot of his work that's being done down in Greenwich Village. So we know from that resume, he was taking that workshop with Harold Feinstein, which was at 473 Hudson Street. And so Feinstein's workshop becomes a real grounding institution for him because he meets people like Herb Randall and then some other members of the photographic community that I'll go into here in a second. So remember that 240 West 10th Street address that was on the back of that photographic print of the chair? Well, we finally were able to figure out that that address was the apartment of Molly Malone Cook. Now, Cook is a really interesting figure because she shows up in several places on Draper's documents. So here we have an employment application form from the archive, and you can kind of see not only is Draper noting this address, but he's also saying care of Cook. And before we found any photographs of Cook in the archive, we were seeing this last name noted on the backs of some photographs and in other documents. Then once we again got into some of the looking through the negatives and some contact sheets, and of course, once Sandra Sellers, the photographer for the project, was able to make these large, high quality image files of the negatives, we could really get in close with some detail. And so we were able to see that Draper had noted on this negative sleeve that there was a portrait of Molly Cook from 1958. And so all of the pieces are starting to fall together. And we could identify Cook within the photograph and also learn a little bit more about her and her relationship with Draper. A little bit of background on her: Cook was a photographer for the Village Voice. And interestingly, in the 1960s, she is still in contact with Louis Draper because she's working with Eugene Smith. And she's really interested in creating a community of photographers that she had planned to exhibit at a gallery in Provincetown called the Seven Photographers Gallery. And we were able to find some resources that indicated that she did in fact plan to exhibit Draper's photographs at Seven Photographers Gallery, and her archives at Smith College actually include, I think, 4 of Draper's prints. Now, we don't have any documentation of whether or not those prints actually made it on her gallery walls, but it's nice to know just how rich the photographic community was that Draper was building while he's working through Feinstein's workshop and then also making these connections. Another interesting thing is that Cook had a relationship and was friends with Lorraine Hansberry. So this photo by Cook dates back to 1957, 1958. And so that just kind of enriches the association that we have with Draper's work and literary figures. If we think about his relationship and living in Langston Hughes Brownstone, this just further enriches what we know about his relationship to literature. And so another figure that shows up on both the application form that I showed earlier and also the resume that I showed earlier is Lawrence Shustak. And for a while, I hadn't been able to find him in the archive at all, actually until fairly recently. I was able to locate him back on that Grove Gallery contact sheet. So here he is working with other photographers to hang their work within the gallery. And Shustak himself was a photographer who worked in Harlem. One of his most well-known portfolios is of the Black Jewish community in Harlem. And it's also worth noting that Lou Draper is working in his studio, so that just gave us another address to kind of further ground him, his early years in New York in Greenwich Village. So if we're looking into 1960 to 1961, Draper moves again. Here we have his address at 24 West 91st Street, and then he's working downtown with Eugene Smith in Eugene Smith's loft at 821 6th Avenue. So this is where, as a research assistant, things got super interesting for me, because one of the unanswered questions that we had was what kind of work Lou Draper was doing in Smith's loft. And also, you're always curious about what conversations that photographers have with one another. But one of the unfortunate things about working with an archive is a lot of those things are lost. However, Smith is an exception, because Smith had a loft in an apartment building in which was located in the Flower District. And that's important to note, because the Flower District at the time did not have a noise ordinance after a certain hour. So many jazz musicians would set up shop in different apartment buildings and practice throughout the night. And Paul Overton had the apartment above Eugene Smith. And so Smith wired his building and his apartment, going between floors sometimes, with recording equipment. And so Sam Stevenson, who is a writer, invested in this Jazz Loft project, which I think has stretched almost 20 years. But as a part of his loft project, he worked to get all those recordings that Eugene Smith had made turned into CDs. And so he had a research assistant that went through and made this incredibly long finding aid of, I think in total there were 1,700 reels that are physically at the Center for Creative Photography in Arizona, but because Stevenson was working with Duke University, those CDs that he made are now a part of their rare book and manuscripts library, and we were able to work with them to get duplicates made, digital duplicates, so we were able to listen through what was happening in Eugene Smith's loft. And because of that finding aid, I was able to isolate about 50 hours of audio material that I listened to try to pick up Draper's voice in their conversations. So I have one that I've pulled out, and there's another one later. I will preface this by saying that the audio quality is not great. So there's a transcription there that you can hopefully follow along and get a sense of the conversation that they had.
This boy Draper is one of the finest talents I had known. First time I ever saw this picture, this is he, by the way. He also worked at Rolling Studio for a while. It was the greatest comment on Rolling Studio I could think of. I mean, and he left the portfolio up there, and I wanted to see it, but it was like those things usually are. One I didn't want to see it while he was around, too. It was quiet. I killed him dashing out somewhere, which is very rare indeed. And he opened the portfolio after about 8 feet away or 6 feet. Beyond my power to say anything else than, God, that's beautiful. You know, for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, I don't know how long now it was, but it must have been at least that. I mean, they're lucky.
So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what kind of sounds I was hearing as I was listening to these loft recordings. And I also should say that Smith isn't talking to Draper specifically. He's talking about Draper's work, but he's talking to Harold Feinstein. So what I actually got to peek in on is every student's, the one thing that they want to know, which is what do my teachers think of me? And so we know that Smith had great admiration for Draper's work. And so that was really helpful to have those recordings because we only have a few photographs that are in negative form in the Draper archive. And so this context sheet shows just one of them. I included this enlargement of a staircase simply because one of the things that I kept hearing in the recordings were people walking up and down stairs. And so you can kind of see, if you have a keen eye, there is what appears to be a print of Smith's Walk to Paradise Garden that's there at the top of the landing. And I also had to include this because working with an archive, with Draper's archive, it was really interesting to see just the massive material that was present in Smith's own loft. And so what I want to do with the rest of my time is to take a little bit of a closer look at a project that Draper did while he was working in Smith's loft. And that was a series of photographs of Lincoln Center. And I did some rough calculations and looking through the archive, and I think there are about 30 context sheets worth of negatives that Draper made in photographing Lincoln Center. And this was a really difficult project for Draper. We know from listening to the tapes that it was not exactly, it was received with mixed reviews is the best way to say, because Smith was looking at some of the prints that Draper had made. And unfortunately, we don't know exactly which prints that he showed in the critique that we can hear on tape, but we, from the negative sheets, can see what kind of visual material Smith was making his assessment with. One of the assessments that he made was that Draper was working with what he called a handicap, meaning that he couldn't get close enough to the construction site. And that has many, many implications. It comes up in conversation that Draper is not a member of ASNP, which is the media photographers organization that might get him access to the site. And then there's also the issue of Draper having a concept for the project that Smith wasn't sure was visually there. And one of the things that Draper was really looking to do was to emphasize some conflict that was occurring between unions. One of the working unions of the construction workers was an integrated union, and the other one was not an integrated union. And so Draper was really looking at this construction site with a critical eye, thinking about not only what he could see, but also what the social implications of the larger project were. And so having this kind of background and knowing some context for the project, it gives us a little more depth. And having such a wide range of material through the archive also gives a little bit of insight into Draper's process. So I've picked out this print, which is actually in the exhibition, this untitled Lincoln Center photograph, as just an example of how we're able to locate negatives of these images in the archive, and then they give us a sense of just what kind of creative working process that the artist is working through. So here we have what appears to be a fairly even exposure in the negative, but then if we look at the print, Draper's really bumped up the contrast. It's very abstract. And so it gives you a little bit of an idea of his process. And the same with this photograph. You have 4 frames from the negative sheet that then he selects the one that has probably almost a dance-like quality in the way that the form has his arms stretched out. And I personally really love the tonal range with the grays, with the concrete structure in the background of the photo. And so here's another example of a print from the Lincoln Center project. An interesting thing that we were able to add to this kind of narrative surrounding the Lincoln Center project was that Draper really not only was looking at the construction workers, but also thinking about the construction in itself and how kind of an alienating a structure it was for the community that actually the construction of Lincoln Center displaced. And so here's another example of something that we can see as far as Draper's working process and linking that process to Eugene Smith. So if you look carefully at this print, this image of the print, there's this kind of halo around the worker. And that may be because Draper, working with Smith, would have picked up this process that Smith used in using ferrocyanide to kind of bleach out portions of a darker print that really gave certain forms like a halo type appearance. And so again, in thinking about more of the social context of Lincoln Center, there are several frames from Draper's negatives that really speak to that. And we also have some papers from graduates, or excuse me, not graduate students, but undergraduate students at Mercer College who responded to one of Draper's visiting lectures in which he showed several of the photographs from his Lincoln Center project. And in these letters, a lot of the students report that Draper was being really critical of and questioning whether or not Lincoln Center, as it was built, would truly be accessible to the community around it, who would be able to attend the events there, and especially in relationship to the community that it displaced. And there's some interesting parallels between Draper's photographs and some of the publicity photographs from Lincoln Center. So I have this detail on the left of a fold from a publicity book that Lincoln Center had done celebrating its opening in 1964. And then they're using this kind of like reoccurring image of somebody looking through the barriers that are around the construction zone as kind of like their first peek at access to this performing arts center. And then Draper himself is also looking at that same action that he's observing in people as he's walking the street. And I should mention that we consider that he's working at Smith's Loft downtown and he's up on 91st Street, the line from north to south, he would definitely be passing Lincoln Center through his commute at some point. And so we can kind of see how Draper's taking a very broad approach in thinking about interactions between photographers and the city. And so Smith had mixed reviews about this project that Draper was working on, but Draper really had a a sophisticated way of thinking about this. It wasn't just a documentary project for him. He was really thinking about it in terms of more social conditions and wider implications of such a project. And yes, he's documenting them, but I think we can see from some of the earlier photographs, he's really taking an abstract view of some of his composition. So it's not exactly about making this photojournalistic narrative, but really engaging with what's happening in front of him. And so I have another clip from the Smith tapes here. And I want to say that this is an extremely quiet clip. So if you have any volume control, you're going to want to have it handy.
But at the same time, I wanted to see if I can be as accurate as possible and at the same time free as far as possible.
Well, what are you trying to be directly interested in here?
Many ideas. Using what is there to say something else outside of what is actually there.
So just to highlight a piece of that recording I have in the transcription here, Draper's emphasis on these mainly ideas and using what is there to say something else. That's something that we continually see throughout his career. He's not really limiting our engagement with the image to simply the formal qualities. And I also wanted to kind of step out of Draper's early years to show just how his concerns that he is showing us through his photographs of Lincoln Center continued throughout his work in the 70s and even the 80s. So we have here some frames from negatives of a Harlem Fights Back meeting in 1970 that was led by James Houghton, the community organizer, who was looking at making sure that specifically Puerto Rican and Black construction workers were getting hours in the construction jobs that were happening around the city. And Draper also provided photographs for this article from Black Enterprise that was published in 1981 called Will We Lose Harlem, which really engaged with issues of gentrification in the city. So we can kind of see how not only the photographs that maybe end up in final exhibition checklists can really give us a better understanding of what Draper's concerns were throughout his career. And in kind of taking a close look at the Lincoln Center project, that really gives us a little bit more of an enriched view of how Draper approached his later projects. And so I think with that, I will turn it back over to Izzy, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sharia. I cannot thank you enough for the role you have played in the research for this project. And oh, there we go, starting video. I feel like the illustration, I shared an office for the audience with Sharia for about 1.5 years and watched her do a lot of this research. And I don't think that there's perhaps a better illustration of your dedication and commitment as a researcher than when you went through the finding aid of the 1,700 reels to find the 50 hours that most likely had Louis Draper on them and in them, and then listen to all 50 hours of that audio, and you shared with us some of the incredible finds you found, and there's more. I think that's part of this project, just the incredible level of detail that Louis Draper left us through his archive, but your commitment to finding and tracing and connecting what those details meant. And I encourage people to read Sharia's chronology, which is really a work of art in itself, because there was so much. One of the most difficult parts of this project was editing, because there's such an incredible wealth of material and so many stories. And I'm so glad that you focused on the Lincoln Center project tonight. So I don't have the words to thank you enough, but I'm glad everybody got to see a little bit of your research process. Thank you again. And I'm going to turn now to introducing our next two speakers. Tonight we are going to hear a conversation between Erna Dugan and Adra Cowens. Adra Cowens is a fine arts photographer, a founding member of Kamoinge, and abstract expressionist painter. He attended Ohio University, where he received a BFA in photography and attended the School of Motion Picture Arts and the School of Visual Arts in New York. While serving in the United States Navy, he worked as a photographer before moving to New York, where he later worked with Life magazine photographer Gordon Parks and fashion photographer Henry Clark. Cowens is the current president of Kamoinge and the recipient of a John Hay Whitney Fellowship and the Martin Luther King Jr. Cesar Chavez Rosa Parks Visiting Scholars Award at Wayne State University. Dr. Erna Dugan is Associate Professor of Art History at Texas State University, where she teaches courses on the history of photography, American art, and art criticism and writing. Her current research project explores intersections between aesthetic experience, activist practices, and the effects they produced in the 1980s. The Nicaragua Media Project and the Limits of Postmodernism, recently published in the Art Bulletin, is part of this project. She's also a contributor to the Working Together catalog, and I also want to thank you, Erna, for your research contributions. Erna is also the author of the book, The Self in Black and White, which had a chapter dedicated to the Kamoinge workshop, and it was really important to me in my early research on Louis Draper and the Kamoinge workshop. And I also want to thank you and let the audience know that you were incredible in gifting us the interview tapes you made in the early 2000s, including interviews with three members of Kamoinge who are no longer with us, Louis Draper, Al Fanar, and Ray Francis. And those were so incredibly important to our research and you, a way of preserving their voices that we would not have had otherwise. And so I just want to thank you for your generosity in your research contributions to the project beyond your essay. And those early interviews included an interview with Adra. And so I'm glad to see you two together tonight having this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to actually get to revisit this work and revisit the Kamoinge workshop. As Sarah mentioned, it was actually my dissertation that I wrote a chapter about the Kamoinge workshop that became part of this book that was published almost, I think, 10 years ago now. So it's really, going back to this work again has been a privilege. And then I reminded Adra that I actually visited with him back in 2001, which is almost 20 years ago now, as I did with so many of the members of Kamoinge. And now it was really, I had these tapes and I wanted to have a place for them to go. And I'm really glad that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts has those tapes now and that it can be part of Draper's archive, because it's such a wonderful resource. As you see from the work, the brilliant work of Sharia, just what one can do with this work is just incredible. And I'm hopeful that young scholars like her will, just take this material and run. I also wanted to thank Izzy for being such a great, facilitator of this digital content to you. She's been super, so I really appreciate that as well. Tonight I have the distinct pleasure of having a conversation with Adra Cowens, who's an amazing photographer. And I guess I just want to frame kind of our conversation a little bit before we get going. As Sarah mentioned, I wrote one of the essays for the catalog, which is that's like a hefty tome, and I'm so honored to be a part of that catalog. And for this essay, I wrote about street photography. I called it Unlearning Street Photography, because I was really thinking about the ways in which street photography comes to dominate, kind of if we think about art photography in the 1960s, but it's often seen through the lens of practitioners, of someone like Gary Winogrand, where the emphasis is often on like the photograph showing this instantaneity that is being captured, this kind of chance quality that's being captured. And this is of course all good and fine, but of course I think that it doesn't allow for other approaches to the street. And so that's what I kind of took up in the essay itself. Today, what I wanted to do is really think about this category of art photography, of which street photography, as espoused especially by the curatorial vision of John Sharkovsky at the Museum of Modern Art, how that really gave us a singular kind of vision of what art photography could be. But in fact, there's many, I would say, competing and different kinds of art photography. In fact, that idea, I think we think today that photography is definitely art, but in the 50s and 60s, this was still being debated and negotiated. And so I hope through Adger's work to kind of show us some of those tensions and some other models that are often kind of overlooked if we just focus on this kind of street photography as shown to us through the lens of Sharkovsky and MoMA. So where I thought we would start, in fact, is of course where, with this particular photograph, I think this beautiful photograph by Adger called Mama's Ohio Piano, as a way to just start our conversation and begin with kind of where you are from, Adger. And especially the importance of family and ways that you were supported in your practice of photography. So you grew up in Ohio, is that right?
Yes, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. And I was born in 1936 at the end of the Second World War. So my whole idea at that time, photography, was considered, it wasn't even a craft, it was a hobby. But it was a hobby that was practiced mostly by people with money. So when I decided I wanted to go to school and study photography based on looking at a book that my sister's boyfriend had, and I told my mother, well, my mother was an amateur photographer, and I had an uncle that was an amateur photographer. So when I told my mother I wanted to do this, she said, well, we have to talk to your father. And so my father said, that's ridiculous. Why would you want to go and study photography when Kodak makes film, camera, they send it to you, and that's it. You send it back and you make, what is this studying photography? Well, after we agreed with my father, because I didn't know what I could do as a photographer, I was just trying to get out of the house and go to college somewhere different. So that was my whole idea and attitude. This picture I took, I guess, probably even after I had come to New York and was working. And my training in photography with Clarence H. White Jr., whose father was Clarence H. White Sr., the whole concept that we studied was the spirit part of photography, personal vision, what hits you in your heart, not just what you see, but how you feel about it. And a lot of that was really tied up with Stieglitz, because Clarence H. White showed in Stieglitz's gallery, and then he started his own school. So Clarence H. White Jr. taught from his father's point of view, which had to do with the spirit in photography. So that was my training. And
this was at at Ohio University, right? And it has one of the first BFA programs, right, in photography. Is that right?
Yes, I think it was the only school at that time that gave a BFA. They later on had a master's program, but at that time it was a BFA. There were others. Well, there was another school in Arizona, but they didn't admit people of color.
And were there other African Americans in your program with you, Adger?
There were 2 students in my class who were African Americans. Well, that word African American, I have a problem because
with that term,
I
right?
consider myself a black man, you
Right.
know, born and raised in America. But when I was coming up, if you called somebody black, you had a fight. You know, first we were colored, then we were Negroes, and then we became African black and African American, now black. So it was just a different time. And so the students in my class, most of them took it as an elective, but it was my major.
And who, so did you work with white, or did you work, was there another professor there that you worked with?
We had three professors. We had Clarence H. White, we had Walter B. Allen, and name skips my mind. We had a female. She was really great. She loved my work, and we talked about photography a lot. Yes, we had 3 teachers. So I guess somewhere along the way, my uncle, because I was complaining that everything was white, and he said, "Why don't you find a black person, you know, that's doing what you're doing?" I said, "There aren't any. I'm not learning about any in school." So he said, you know, ask your teacher. So I asked Walter B. Allen. Betty Truxell was the other teacher. So I asked Betty Truxell, and I asked him, Walter B. Allen. He was like a New York hippie, you know, he wore these outfits and he would smoke a cigarette and burn all the way down to the end. So he said, "I think there's a black man at Life magazine." So I wrote for it. There was a book that came out that year on Life magazine photographers, and he was in the back in the corner of the book. So I wrote him a letter, and he wrote me back and told me to look him up when I came to New York. Well, everybody said, "Wow, really, really?" So we were going back and forth to New York a lot because David Hostetler, our sculpture teacher, was a jazzophile. And so we would go back and forth to New York. When Monk was at the 5 Spot, or Miles was at Carnegie Hall. Now, I had 2 very good friends while I was in school. One was James Corrales, and the other was Paul Fusco. And we would go to New York sometimes on our own. And one weekend we went there. I was going to look in bookstores. And he said, "Let's go by and see Eugene Smith." So it must have been 10 o'clock at night. We climbed the stairs and knocked on his door. And he came. He had a tray in his hand with a print he was making. And he said, "You guys," he said, "we're from college, from school." He said, "Oh, come on in, come on in." He said, "Wait, I'm in the dark room." So he comes out with this print and he shows it to us. He said, "What do you think?" And me, big mouth, I said, "Oh, it's too dark." And he said, "I think you're right, you know." So Paul and James said, "Man, come on, man, this is Eugene Smith." I said, "Well, he asked me." So, you know, we really loved the work of Eugene Smith because we felt it was somewhere beyond documentary or street photography. We felt that his work had a humanity to it, and that's what we liked.
And Corrales, he was his student. Didn't he become Smith's studio assistant, I think, at some point?
Yeah, he was his studio assistant after that. Yes.
After that. Yeah. And is Smith also someone, I mean, so I know we also have this image that's reproduced in the catalog of Lou Draper holding up this very, you know, issue of Life magazine that this photo essay by Smith appears, and he's holding it up here, in fact, at your studio.
Yes.
So what did, and then he's in front of then Buford's 1968 series about the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, what is, so you've mentioned a little bit about, you know, the importance of Smith. Is it also because, I mean, this essay in particular, Nurse Midwife, that we see?
No, it wasn't just that. It was a lot of the things that Smith had done. There was a picture of Schweitzer.
The doctor.
Head was over and the hair was hanging down. We all liked that photograph a lot, but we felt that he was really different from most of the photojournalists. I was a person, I didn't like photographs that had words on them. I felt that why would you put words on a photograph?
Yeah.
You know, it didn't make
Yeah.
sense. Photographs should say what it's about. So there was two different schools, so we kind of like argued back and forth about that. But at that time in photojournalism, they would write these comments under the photographs. I thought it didn't make sense. I was more interested in capturing in the photograph what it meant. Well, I mean, that was my whole training. And, you know, we looked at actual prints of Stevens's and Weston and Paul Strand, all these people we looked at because Clarence H. White Jr. had these in his collection. So we saw actual prints. You have to remember at that time, there were no books on photography in the 50s. It didn't exist. You know, there were no books on Ansel Adams or anybody. There wasn't even a book on the history of photography until later on. There was an older copy, but it really wasn't flushed out. Later on, there was a full book on that. But these were the types of guys we liked. I also liked, you know, Roy DeCarava's work too, because he used a certain area of the spectrum to speak about it. And it was beautiful. I had never seen pictures like that. I found this book one weekend when I went to New York, and this must be at least 1952, 51, 52, something like that. 54.
You're talking about the Sweet
I got out of school.
Paper of Life? Yeah.
So it'd be 57, yeah, something like that. With Langston Hughes's writing, I thought it was. I never seen.
55. Yeah.
Yeah. So I bought the book. I bought 3 of them, and all my books were stolen when I came to New York out of my car. I left all my photographic books in my car, and they were all stolen. But anyway.
And that book is so tiny too. It was so tiny, you know,
small.
initially.
It was paperback. It wasn't hardback. This is Louis at my loft because we would meet in different people's houses. You know, we didn't have a regular meeting place, so we'd meet in different places. So one day he said, "Agile, let's go to your loft." I said, "We can hardly move down there, but we'll find a spot." So they came down there, and we were discussing how to put emotion into the street photography that we were doing.
Yeah.
You know, Louis and I, when the Kamoinge group started, Louis and I were the only ones that had any kind of education in photography. All the guys that came around were mostly amateurs. They had different jobs, you know. I mean, Ray worked in a camera store. Alphanar was the glazier. Clean worked at Bellevue. Everybody had these different jobs, but they loved to take pictures. So we would get together on the weekends, and Louis was the good guy, and I was the bad guy. He was a good cop, and I was the bad cop. I was really hard on people because I had a 4-year really grounding in everything having to do with photography.
And is it also, go ahead. So, so moving to this image, so after school, you go into the Navy, right? And do you photograph? Do you do some photographing for the Navy too? Is that right?
Yeah, I was a photographer in the Navy. I was assigned to a top secret squadron. We wasn't talk about it, but what it was actually was I was at Virginia Beach, Virginia, Oceana Naval Air Station, where they flew and tested the latest fighter planes.
Oh, okay.
So that was, you know, and sometimes they would crash, and it was all, so it was very top secret. I didn't think it was so top secret, but it was. So that's where I was. But that summer that I finished school, I came to New York, and I worked with Gordon at Life magazine.
That's when, that
was before I went in the Navy.
That was before, okay. And we'll come back to Gordon in a minute too,
I was working with Gordon, you know, and just before I went in the Navy, I got an offer to work with color photographer, one of the first ones, Saul Leiter. He called me and asked me if I would come and print for him. He liked my color work. I did a lot of work with color when I was in school. So I had to go in the Navy because my mother called me and said, you got a letter from the White House. And I said, what do you mean? She said, you got a letter from the White House. I said, read it, Mama. I said, well, greetings from your friends and neighbors at the White House. You've been selected among the fortunate few to serve in the armed forces of the United States. So off I went. I had been in the reserves and navies, so I didn't report back in. So when I came back home, they were going to put me in the Army. So I ran to my CO in the Navy. I said, please be. He said, okay, if you go in next week. So I never got back to New York. All my portfolio, all this stuff was lost. So
yeah.
I had another few months in the Navy when I took this picture. And this was like, golly, I'm getting now how great it's going to be. I'll be able to take beautiful pictures again. And that's what this picture was like. When I saw this, I said, oh, this is my omen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it reminds me a lot of something like Ansel Adams and thinking about the F-64 photographers. And I'm wondering, I mean, to what extent they also were important for you.
Yes, because my favorite out of all that group was Edward Weston. And I think that for me, the first time I saw prints of his, I just was drooling. I had never seen pictures that beautiful. They were almost 3D, you know, the tonalities and stuff.
Yeah.
And Adams was more, for me, the zone system.
Yeah.
You know? And that was a hard system to learn, but I thought he was a great photographer too. And I loved their books.
Their books, yeah. And then this photograph, I mean, gets around a little bit. It appears in 1963 in this exhibition called Photography 63, an international exhibition that was co-sponsored by the New York State Exposition and the George Eastman House, which of course was directed by Nathan Lyons. Do you remember this exhibition at all? Yeah.
This was the first exhibition I felt that I was in that I considered to be artistic photography, so to speak, because everybody in this show was handpicked. And Nathan Lyons called me on the phone and told me he really liked my work a lot and he wanted me to put me in the show. Now at this time, you have to understand, they didn't know what color I was. It wasn't about color in the beginning days. It was all about photography. I mean, I used to meet guys on the street. I had Joel Meyerowitz, all these guys I used to meet on the street shooting. And we always kind of gathered together and went and had a drink, a beer or something, because we were all interested in photography. There were no photography stars at that time, and photography wasn't considered an art at this time. Photography was still considered a craft. And everybody that was all the artists, the painters, we had fights with them all the time because they said, well, you know, it's a craft, it's not art. It didn't become an art in the serious sense in the art world until Ansel Adams was on the cover of Time magazine. That was 1979.
And so, yeah, so they're trying, so the importance, of course, of the George Eastman House, they are also, we also see that Lou's work gets included in an exhibition. That was, and Photography 63 was actually kind of a company, right? It was it was an accompany to this exhibition, Photography at Mid-Century, which was curated by Beaumont Newhall. So again, thinking about, you know, these other institutions, I think, where photography's art status, you know, was negotiated. So your photograph also then appears in Harper's Bazaar in 1964. And this is, it accompanies a short essay or a short story by Nadine Gordimer, who's a South African author. How did your work get in Harper's Bazaar? I mean, so it's in this right? It's in this you know, at the George Eastman House at this museum, but then also then in Harper's Bazaar. How does that happen?
It's a short story and a long story. I had really wanted to shoot fashion, and I took my portfolio to Harper's Bazaar of some fashion things that I'd done, and they liked the work a lot. Be a Fighter and Ruth Ansell. And so they started out by putting this photograph, and then I did some photographs for them, and then we got into a big argument because I was like, I don't know, I wasn't into that scene, whatever it wasn't my scene. And so I had some resistance to, you know, what was going on there. And so yeah, I did a couple of jobs for them, and then I didn't do anything else for them after that. I kind of left that scene. But they liked this photograph, and they put it in there, and I did a couple of jobs for them.
Yeah. So it's this also, I mean, I think it speaks to also, I mean, the ways in which, you know, photographers at this time would work in different in different spaces, even that you could do, you know, editorial work and also art photography, you know, at the same time. There was not these kinds of rigid, or, you know, that it was a lot more fluid. The image.
That was
okay,
that training. Because not only did we learn studio photography and portraiture, but we learned everything. I mean, this was a 4-year course in photography. It was pretty thorough. So we had all this stuff.
So the same, oh yeah,
photography wasn't about specialization, saying, well, I only do food, or I only do, you have to learn everything.
Well, especially if you want to make a living at it, right? So
I wasn't really concerned so much about making a living. That was part of the problem with me, you know. I was more concerned about what was happening with me inside, personal. I had a personal feeling about photography, and I worked commercially for a while, but I didn't like it because, you know, they would tell you to do something, if it wasn't right, you had to reshoot it. And I was coming out of the Cartier-Bresson, you know, Eugene Smith School, where you had to get it quick and it had to be right. And so we were shooting with 35 millimeter cameras, which at that time people were saying that's not a camera, it's a toy. You mean this camera costs a lot? No, it's a toy. It's a toy. You had to have at least a 2 1/4 size camera to be considered a serious photographer, or if you were shooting with speed graphic news. I didn't want to do it all. I was more concerned about I wanted to shoot things people hadn't seen.
And so the same year it's in Harper's, it also appears in Infinity, which was the magazine, or the Journal of the American Society of Magazine Photographers. Sharaya mentioned them for a second. Were you part of ASMP?
I was part of ASMP.
Yeah.
I think the art director at that time saw my photographs. I had an agent, and she carried my work around, and they selected that. I don't think I even met anybody at Infinity.
At all.
They liked the work.
They liked the work. So they showed, and your this is also your photograph on the cover, correct?
Icarus.
Although they have it a different title, Jumping Child, right on there. I like Icarus better. I think it's a beautiful,
But you know, in those days, they would put any title on your work.
On your work right.
You could have there, because here again, words on pictures. They wanted titles. If you didn't have nothing on there, you know, they would put a title to it. So that's how Jumping Child got on there.
It happens. And then your work is also shown at the Heliography Gallery in I think this was 1965. And I want to talk a little bit about the Heliography Gallery, the Association of Heliographers, again, as this kind of like thinking about other institutions that existed at the same moment. Do you want to talk a little bit about this group?
the heliographers was something that started with Walter Chappell and Paul Caponegro. And the whole idea and concept had to do with photography as art. You had to have a point of view. They didn't have any commercial. There were no commercial photographers in this group. In fact, some of the big name photographers put their work in and were rejected. I won't name names, but they were big because they felt that it was commercial. They wanted to see work that had to do with how you felt, how you personal vision kind of work. So if you look at all the guys who were in that gallery and you see their work, you know, Carl Chirenza, Maria Casindis, Jerry Ulsman, it was, you know, these people were pushing the idea of art forward and getting rejected. I mean, we had a lot of people, you know, saying, well, what is it? You know, it's not a guy walking down the street. And I had pictures of stones and water and things like that. But I think that it was a great gallery because out of that gallery came some really great photographers, but it had to do with photography as art. And I think at this time, this was the only gallery. There was a gallery, what was it called? Downtown, way downtown.
The Whitkin Gallery? The
what?
The Whitkin Gallery?
Yeah, I don't think Whitkin was shooting yet. They might have been. Yeah, they weren't downtown. They were on, they were midtown somewhere first before they went downtown. And then they kind of hooked up with the Leica Gallery and they showed something too. But I think that came after this. The heliography at that time that I can remember, it was one of the few galleries that showed photography as art.
Yeah, and then there was also Roy de Carava's, what was it, a photographer's gallery? But that was in his home, right?
Right.
Yeah. So when I was doing my research back 20 years ago, and this is, you know, why you should never throw anything away. When I got asked to do this discussion with you, I was like, oh, I've got a folder on Azure. And and one of the pieces of paper that I pulled out of there was some research that I had done at MoMA. And so besides, I mean, this one-man show at the Heliographers Gallery got reviewed also by Jacob Deschen, who's an important photography critic for the New York Times at that point. And then it also was visited by Grace Mayer, who in fact was a curator at MoMA at the time. She, you know, often we just think of Tchaikovsky, but she actually was a curator at the same, at that same moment. She was a curator there from 64 to 68. She had previously been, the personal assistant to Edward Steichen and goes on to be the curator of the Steichen Archive. But in the files, I found her notes. She had typed up these notes. She had visited the Heliographers Gallery and seen your exhibition. And she typed up some notes, which I think are wonderful to look at, of some of your images, and including, and we're going to look at a couple of them, you know, that rocks, trees, water in an abstract vein. Very interesting street scene with odd cropping, showing three figures and their Giacometti-like shadows, which I love. We'll take a look at that image in a minute. Interesting shot of his child in window, fire escape, series of store churches. We'll look at that too. Sculptured head of President Kennedy, multiple double exposures of trees and girls' heads, snowy street, vase and pendulum, series of nudes. So it's really it was really wonderful for me to kind of go back and find this. And I thought we would just look at a few of the images that she singles out. And I don't know, do you remember her, right? Is that right? Before
I have a couple of letters from her.
Is that right?
She's very nice, very mild-mannered person and very, very sweet. She tried to buy a photograph from each show that we had there. And sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't. but I guess it was based on what she had to take back and say, well, I want this, or they reject or whatever. But I think that she really wanted to buy more work than she bought. That was her whole idea. She said that she wanted to buy everybody's work that was in the gallery there, but evidently at that time, and they were cheap photographs at that time.
Yeah.
$75. Oh, that was high price. 35,
Oh,
$40
man.
is what
Man.
photographs were going for. And people were glad to get $35 for a photograph.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
she was really, I think she loved photography, number one. That was the big thing that she liked to talk about it. She understood it. And that was important because there were very few people who really understood what photography is about. They kept comparing photography to painting. Oh, it's very painting, or it looks like painting. They were not sensitized to what photography could do or what photography was in terms of dealing with light. But she understood it.
So here are a few of the images that she singles out. This Little Flower Baptist Church, which you photographed that in. Where did you photograph that?
In Harlem,
In Harlem.
right down the same, I think Ray photographed the same building. Herb did, yeah.
Herb did, yeah. So this is Bed-Stuy, so maybe in, yeah. And I love the danger, keep away, thinking about.
My religious, I did a whole series on religion.
This on these storefront churches, yeah, that just, and then of course she talks about your water photographs or your abstract photographs, which, I mean, I think one of the things that's so great about you, Adger, is that you resist categorization, right? I mean, you do.
I didn't want to be, one of the things that Gordon told me early on about my work, he said, you have your own point of view. He said, I don't see you working here at Life Magazine. And at first I thought he don't want me to work there because I'm good. But he told me, he said, if you work at this magazine, your ideas and the concepts that you have will be filtered through what Life Magazine wants to do. And I thought, okay, I understood that, so I went over to Everyday Magazine. And I talked to my friend over there, and he said, Adger, you don't want to work here. He said, if you do, they will steal whatever it is you're doing and you won't own it. He said, I think you're better off doing what you're doing. He said, you'll get there. Just keep doing what you're doing. That was Moneta Sleet. He was working. Yeah, very, very nice man.
And Gordon wrote the introduction, right? This is the book, your book called Moments.
Yeah, I started photographing water in 63, 64, something like that. And so my friend who owned Green Street, I showed him the picture. He said, we'll do a show, man. We'll do a book. And I thought, yeah, right. So he called me the next day. He said, do you want to do a show? I said, I do. So we did a show at the Green Street Gallery. The photographs were 40 by 60 inches. There were 16 of them.
Wow.
And people came in, and some people were wowed, and some people thought, oh, it's just water, and they walked out. But the Asians, I'll say, the Chinese, the Japanese, the people from France, different people, not Americans, they walked in, they sat down, they looked at the photographs, and they felt them, because that's what this was about. We are 75, 80% water. This is like a direct electrical connection, visual electrical connection to the body. We never think about it. These are very calming, and the more you look at it, the more calmer you become, I think.
And oh yeah, go ahead. Oh, is Romeo Bearden that wrote the intro for this? Yeah.
I showed
Gordon.
and you know, he's a painter, and I liked Romy a lot, and we were friends. He lived down on Canal Street, and I would see him from time to time. So one day we stopped and we started talking, and we became friends. So he says, "Come over anytime," you know. So I went over a lot, you know, just because I loved his work. And so I said, "Romy, I got these photographs. I'm going to do a show." I said, "I'd like to show them to you." And I showed him, and he started talking. I said, "Well, would you write the intro?" I mean, and he said, "Had you?" Yeah. He said, "Sure, sure." And what he wrote was beautiful.
Yeah. And this is this is actually the image of the book as it's shown at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, because it's part of the exhibition.
Right.
Yeah.
And this particular photograph is called Moments for Billy.
Yeah. Is that, you want to say something about that? Is it?
Well, I named most of them after jazz musicians because I felt it dealt with rhythm, it dealt with time, it dealt with all the things that music deals with. And plus you had a visual image. So this is Moments for Billy. You know, there's Duke Delivers and Monk Plunks, and I wrote a little poem in the back to all of it. But I just felt that these kinds of photographs, I wanted to make photographs that when you looked at them, it would be right now. I mean, these photographs are years old, but it's still right now. When you look at it, I look at them now and I still feel that same feeling that I'm looking at something for the first time.
Absolutely. So she also, this is I think an image, maybe it's, since it's 66, maybe it's one similar to that, but she talks about an image with the shadows that look like Giacometti, and this image.
The photograph.
Yeah.
Well, in the photo that I did at that time, I cropped out the car so it had
okay.
And that's what she saw. But later on, when I looked at the image, I said, I'm shooting myself in the foot by cutting out the car.
The car.
It works, the balance. So
works better.
Yeah, it works much better.
I see. This is, so this image, of course, made me think also of, you know, someone like Lee Friedlander, who is photographing at the same time.
I knew Lee.
Lee. Yeah.
Together, I'm telling you. In those days, we would see each other on the street, and I mean, I don't know how to explain. It was a very small group of photographers at that time who were actually shooting and walking in the street with 35mm cameras. If you were shooting and you were a photographer, you were working in a studio and you were shooting commercial work. To be out shooting stuff like this was very, very different. You know, this was new. We were capturing life as it was happening on the street, wherever. So we all became very good friends. All these guys that shot in the street. I was mentioning Joel Meyerowitz before. I used to see him all the time.
Yeah. Not the same anymore. You can't just do that anymore, right?
Now, nobody, and people would give information, you know. I don't know how do I say this. What's his name? The Americans.
Robert Frank. I'm at a show in a gallery. I'm shooting with my Leica, and I'm walking around trying to be incognito, you know. And he slides up to me and whispers in my ear, "I know you're a good photographer. I can tell by the way you're shooting." So after we went, and he said, "Oh, I'm a photographer too, and I'm trying to publish this book, and I'm having a problem, you know." And he showed me almost like a Xerox copy of it. And he said, "Nobody will take it." He said, "I've been to like 20 publishers and nobody will take it." But later on, it's one of the premier books in the history of photography. So you can understand at that time, these guys went from nothing to really being the leaders in the field, which they were. So It also makes me think, though, I mean, especially, her calling these Giacometti, like, comparing the shadows to Giacometti, this concern that I think you can see from, the beginning of your work with form. And here's another, photograph of yours from the late 50s, this classic image of yours, which is really about form. You want to talk about this for a moment?
Well, this is my love for Edward Weston.
Right. I have an Edward Weston here. Here we go.
The way he dealt with the female form, and I loved his work. So this was sort of like a shout out to him.
Yeah, it definitely, right, the form of that. And then, of course, also you mentioned Roy de Carava before. I think, his concern, and thinking about, he has a number of photographs that are shot from above as well. But also in this image, the black and white, the form, is really, I think, something that concerned him greatly.
Great
to see that speaking, so to think about your work in conversation with all of these different practices, approaches, individuals.
In the olden days, we were hunters. We went out and hunted. Life was the hunting ground. Sometimes you didn't know what you were going to see, but you were ready to respond to whatever it was, because you had rehearsed with your eye and your finger and your heart to get this thing when you saw it and felt it, because a second later it would be totally different.
So I'm kind of fascinated by this view from above. This is another one of your works where you adopt that approach, and it's at, I guess it's Malcolm X is speaking, is that right?
Yeah, this is Malcolm X. Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Shadows, the little shadows of the people.
Yeah.
So, people did not understand how important Malcolm was and the crowds that he drew. He drew big crowds. This was both sides of the street. And in fact, this is the street at the top of the frame is the street, but across the street, there's another line of people. So and this is a wide angle lens. There are more people to the right and the left, but that's all I could get with my 28 from the rooftop. But there were a lot more.
Yeah, and it also shows, this, the ways that you're bringing politics, right, into the work as well. It made me think, at least, of also other modernists, because we have the kind of Western modernist photography, but we could also go back and think about someone like Rodchenko. Yeah, and the form, right, is equally important to him, but also thinking about new ways of seeing, right, his thinking about a new vision, and that new vision that happens when you, switch from the kind of belly button photography to an aerial, right, which you're able to do that with a handheld camera, what you can do with a handheld camera. It also made me think of someone like Tina Modotti, who's also, of course, working with Weston, but we see this kind of politics come into her images as well. These workers demonstration in Mexico City. So thinking about the conversation that your work also has with these other photographers. And then you have that view from above, but then you also have an image like this, right, where you're photographing Malcolm, up close. It appears at least up close.
Yep, it is. Well, I had 180 millimeter 2.8 Russian lens. So I didn't have to get right up on him, but I got close.
And it's a very different image, right?
Another time, I must have photographed Malcolm. Oh, every time he was there speaking, I'd be up there trying to do something. And so this was 63.
And it's the same time, of course, that, and you've talked about Gordon Parks already, that this important, I think, essay about the Black Muslims appears in Life magazine. So there's a kind of conversation, it seems like, happening around this time of different photographers, right, engaging with Malcolm as subject matter. I think that would be a fascinating exhibition on its own.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a book that came out called The Best Picture of Malcolm X.
Of him. Yeah, and so then I was thinking also, yeah, so this is your portrait of Gordon that you made.
And you know, Gordon's a hard person to photograph. He's, you know, he wasn't the kind of person that, you know, he was sitting there and I said, and he had his pipe, you know, and I said, you know, Pops, let me take a picture of you. He said, oh, Jackson. You know, Gordon was a mumbler. And I said, well, just sit there. And then when I shot it and I showed it to him, he said, this is a good photograph. He said, I like it. He said, you really caught something there. He said, I really like it. So I was really happy because, you know, Gordon was hard and he was a cropper. If the picture didn't have what, you know, should be in, he would crop it. But I learned to shoot without cropping, you know. You shoot the frame. That's your frame. You frame it and you shoot it. You don't say, well, it's going to blow it up later on. So most of my pictures are full frame. I don't do any cropping.
Yeah. So there's, so there's also just I'll just go through these quickly. Just some other members of Kamoinge also engaging with Malcolm X. I was really surprised to see this image by Lou. I hadn't realized that he had, which is a very different kind of photograph than you know, the one than your picture, even Gordon's picture. But even someone like Buford, of course, is engaging, right, with Malcolm, with the national, with Michaud's National Memorial African Bookstore.
We were trying to document this important event that was going on in our lives, that was changing our lives, that was changing the world, you know, and we felt committed to photographing this. We felt this was our job because we felt that a lot of the white photographers would come to Harlem, they would shoot negative images of us, which was just didn't stick. Or they shot images that were very commercial looking. You could tell that they were there to shoot a job for whatever it was. But we felt we had a closer connection to our family. And so we all got out there in the street.
And Malcolm would speak here also at the bookstore, is that right? Yeah. And then there's, and I love this picture by Buford. And then there's Al. I wanted to bring in an Al Fanar. Obviously, this is later, but I think it's, you know, it still speaks to that same, right? Having a conversation around that same theme. And then, of course, your beautiful photograph, which is quite different than, right, the view from above or the frontal portrait of Malcolm. But this is at his funeral, and it's such a poignant image. You want to talk about it for a second?
Oh, I woke up that morning feeling really bad that Malcolm had been shot, you know, all that week. I mean, and I said, I'm not going to the funeral. I don't want to be there. Everybody will be there taking pictures. And everybody will be jostling to get a picture, you know, of this event. And I wasn't really interested in doing it, you know. And I was living on 150th Street in Condon Avenue. And I got up that morning, and usually I always have my camera with me. And I walked around the corner and down the street, and I saw all these news guys. Well, I knew several of them because I was in the union, you know, International Photographers and Motion Picture Industry. And I knew these guys were there. I said, what are you doing? They all stand. I said, what are you waiting for? He said, oh, we're waiting for Betty Shabazz to come out of the building, you know. But she was coming out the back side of the building. All these people in the front, out the back, and avoided a lot of the big crowds. So I just stood there right behind my friend there with the camera on it.
Right.
And he said, come on, come on. Because I didn't have a press pass. You know, you had to have a press pass to get there. And I didn't have a press pass. So I slid up, you know, behind him and got this picture. I mean, when I shot it, I was in tears.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, the framing, the different frames, and the gaze is amazing. All right, so
everybody's distracted. Everybody's
like
it was painful for everybody. Painful.
So just since we have to wrap up so that we have time for Q&A, I'm gonna go through these a little quickly, but you just to make sure everyone gets a sense of the diversity of your practice. So you also went to Mississippi under the John Hay Whitney, right, with the John Hay Whitney Fellowship, and you were supposed to photograph Medgar Evers, no?
No, I down there with Snick.
Oh, you went down to, okay.
Yeah, and I went to Life Base. I said, oh man, I'm got to go down there and stay. I don't have any film. I said, I just got, you know, this grant from the Whitney, but I don't have any film. And money hasn't come in. So, and I knew the editor there. He said, okay, man. He said, give him 100 rolls, you know. So he said, we'll publish it when you come back, but they didn't because it was too poignant. It was too.
Oh, really?
It was too deep for them to, you know. It wasn't a story that I shot. Feeling of what was going on. And Pete Seeger happened to be there, and Theodore Bickel. Who else was there? A whole bunch of people. Who were really, you know, Bob Dylan was there, you know, talking about freedom, you know, we come, etc. So I shot this picture of Pete Seeger and the Stick guys.
Good one. Well, it's a good way to kind of segue into, of course, I mean, you are a master portraitist, right? This is Mick Jagger. I mean, we could just go on and on. So I'm just going to show these at the end, and hope maybe we can return to them in the Q&A. Especially, I'm struck by the gaze. This is Diane Carroll. Your use of the gaze in these pictures. It's so, yeah, lots to be said there. Here's Romy Bearden. Of course, I think you also have a great ability, right, to photograph people unaware, seemingly unaware, and the difference. I mean, we could talk about, yeah, what kind, you know, making a portrait with someone acknowledging the camera or not. And this one I really love too, of Stevie Wonder and Muhammad Ali. That was at his birthday, right? At
birthday party, yeah, 77.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to end, and then we can, I think Sarah's going to come back on for Q&A, but just to show, of course, that you don't stop. And currently you're the president of Kamoinge, and this is just a snapshot of your website with with the various members that are listed there. I thought that's just a good way to kind of bring us up to the present moment, but I'm gonna let Sarah come back on and start the Q&A.
Thank you. This has been amazing. I'm just so grateful for your conversation, and there have been a lot of really interesting questions. I think I'm gonna go roughly chronological. One of the questions, Adra, is an interest in kind of given your early photography training and the critiques that were happening in Kamoinge, there was a question about the photographic vocabulary. What kind of vocabulary were you using, especially given that photography was so new at being accepted as a fine art and being taught in universities? And were you pulling, the question is, was the vocabulary coming from painting or architecture, or how did you develop kind of a way to talk critically about your photographs in these early Kamoinge meetings?
Well, it came from my training at OU, because we would put the photographs up, and the person, the photographer who did the work, couldn't say anything. You know, you had to sit there and listen to what everybody said about your work, and you couldn't open your mouth. You know, and in that sense, you picked up from other people how they felt about your work. You know, if you talked and said, well, what I was trying to do here, and I didn't get my camera out fast enough, or I didn't change the aperture. No. You put it up there and you take your hits. But I think that a lot of people learn that way, what not to do and what to do, just by listening to what other people had to say about their work. Sometimes, you know, some people be crying. People, oh man, you don't like my work. Or, you know, there was arguments. You know, there was a lot of discussion going back and forth, because, you know, people were very connected to their work.
We had another question about your connection with Afrocobra. So we heard about heliographers. You were also painting with Afrocobra, and were there any other connections between the Kamoinge workshop and Afrocobra, or were you sort of just participating in them both separately? How and when did that connection happen?
Separated, but there was a similar philosophy, and that philosophy had to do with doing photographs and art from our point of view to our people. Mm-hmm. You know, we wanted to make pictures for people that couldn't afford art. You know, we wanted to give them the best of what we had. So we made beautiful art and sold it cheaply. We made mostly posters of our work, and that was the whole idea, to let the people have the work.
And when did you join Afrocobra?
1979.
1979. Okay. And you're going to have some of those paintings on view soon, right?
Yes.
Trying to prompt you. You're going to have photographs and paintings on view at the same time.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting, because this is probably the first time that I've ever shown painting and photography together. I've kept them separate. I got two different sets of people, but I think that Bruce Silverstein wants to show both.
Great. And when do they?
I think they go up online tomorrow.
Okay.
They're in the Freeze Festival. Okay. So I think they're up online today or tomorrow. I don't know which day they go up.
And Adra, you do painting, photography, but you also are a musician, correct?
Oh, don't say that. I'm a closet musician. I'm in the closet with that. All these things. I wouldn't say I'm a musician. I'm in the closet. I just play around the house for myself.
But multi-talented, I think, again, right? It speaks to, like to, right, work in just one style or approach, not just one art form.
I'm trying to, at this point in my life, I always wanted to direct a film. And so I'm not directing this film, but I'm working on a film that I would like to produce. And I don't know, we're working hard to get that together. Fred Williams is the writer. Andrew Wyatt is doing publicity. Judy James is the producer, and I'm associate producer. So it's called Heroes of Tulsa, 1921. And it's what people call the Tulsa riots, but it wasn't a riot, it was a slaughter. So we want to show a different point of view. The view that we want to show is how heroic these Black people were men and women defending their territory or their right to be there. So I'm working on that. That's a secret, doesn't it? Get that out of the bag. So, because I think it's important that American history, everybody was brainwashed, you know, I think, because American history has been taught from one, you know, one area, or I should say, it's been taught through a white filter. So young white people and young black people and all of us in America have learned the history the wrong way. We haven't gotten the real truth. So this film will help to bring part of the truth of the true America. I still, even when I was a child and a kid, I really believed the idea of a smelting pot, that we could have all races together and move forward as human beings. I still believe that. Well, I was a daydreamer when I was a kid. What can I tell you? My teacher had to come to school, and she told my mother, she said, Adger's a good student. When I call on him, he has the answer, but he's always daydreaming. And I think that daydreaming is what really helped me, I think, in dealing with life. You know, and if I had to say anything to young people, that's what I would say. I don't care if you're black, white, blue, gray, grizzly gray, man, woman, whatever your sex, your orientation is. If you have a dream, you can define it. Your dreams are waiting for you to define them. Quit listening to the outer chatter. You know, quit trying to be like everybody else. Be who you are. And if you listen to that little voice inside, it will never lead you wrong. And you know, that's your strongest suit, is defining your own dreams. You have, everybody's got it, every human being on the planet. And as an artist, it's very important.
I don't know, Adger, if you're looking at the chat, but you're getting a lot of love from the audience right now, who are loving your words of wisdom and are deeply appreciating them.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And you know, one of the connections I wanted to make between Shreya's presentation and your conversation with Erina, and something that I think that it has taken archival research to uncover, is the role of women in making spaces for photography. Because I think through talking to you, through talking to Jimmy Manis, and then from Shreya looking at the backs of photographs and finding Molly Cook's address, and Erina, you looking at Grace Mayer's papers at MoMA, I'm just struck by how many women in the late 50s and the early 60s were the ones who were opening galleries. So I made myself a little list. It was Helen, and I was thinking about, Erina, you saying you're hoping that there are some young scholars that are going to take all this up and run with it. It's Helen G's Limelight Gallery. There was Molly Cook then, who was working with Eugene Smith and who opened her gallery. There was Grace Mayer at MoMA, who I just think so often we talk about Steichen and we talk about Sarkowski, but we don't talk about Grace Mayer. And then Adele Glasgow and Ramona Lowe, who opened Marketplace Gallery, which is where Kamoinge had their first 3 exhibitions, and which also, I think Randy Weston, the musician, talked about how they met there at Marketplace Gallery, and how Adele Glasgow played a role there with Langston Hughes in making that space for them. Jimmy Manis talked a lot about Ruth Logan and her role in the Youth in Action program in Brooklyn, but then also in helping Jimmy Manis get into NYU's film program, which then opened the way for Lou Draper and from Danny Dawson. And then a lot of talk about Jean Blackwell Hudson at County Colon Library, and the spaces she made there for photographers to show their work at the library. So I just was struck in thinking through all of these connections, some of these names much better known, and other names really take finding stamps and addresses on the back of a photograph to recover. But I'm just grateful to have also learned about that history through Kamoinge, through the research, and through talking to all of you. I think that that's another aspect, I think, of this material. And I don't know, Adra, what you remember about the early days. I want to hear as much and know as much about that marketplace gallery.
I remember a lot about the early days. I mean, when we started, and this is before Lou started even making notes, we would get together at Ray's house, and his wife would make chili or and some kind of big bowl of food, big pot of food. And, you know, not everybody was making a lot of money at that time. And we would all eat and drink wine and decorate our heads and talk a lot of stuff about photography and about movies, the latest movies. You know, I remember that when I first went up there and I showed my portfolio, they looked at me and asked me 1,000 questions. And I whipped out a light meter and they said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a light meter." They said, "What do you need a light meter for?" And so I explained what the light was. There was a lot of back and forth with, you know, I would give guys assignments. I say, "Go photograph something you never photographed before." Yes, oh, I want to photograph black, but no, go photograph the snow. Go photograph your shadow. Go photograph it. I just, you know, I was always trying to get them to see beyond, you know, not beyond themselves, but beyond the fact that photography is not limited, you know. And once you understand how to use it, the technique, you really have to learn that. You know, you can't go on, you know, the internet, take a couple of pictures and put them up. You have to understand what it is to work in the darkroom. You have to understand exposure and light and all that, you know, and it is work. It's something you have to learn. And when you have that down, then you can begin to express. I always tell my students, you shoot pictures not with your eyes, but with your heart. If you feel something, that's when you press the button. You see beautiful stuff all day, but when something really hits you, what do? Take a picture of it. If it's a beautiful girl, you go talk to her. Excuse me, because somewhere you've been touched. You know, it's the same in meeting people. You meet people the first time, sometimes you don't like that person because of the vibration that you feel, that invisible thing. It's not invisible. You walk with this energy around you every day. And then you meet another person and you're friends for life. What is that? Well, it's the same energy in taking a picture. You know, when I'm taking a picture of a person, I'm trying to capture them. I work to capture who they are, or what I feel they are, or whatever the energy is that's giving off to them. The thing that changed me in college was the fact that, because I'm quiet and a wallflower basically, but when I showed people my photographs and I listened to what they said about them, it gave me a sort of a cheap psychology into who that person was. Because they would talk about the photograph, how they felt. I don't like it, or I love it, or it makes me feel this, or that's ugly, or that's whatever it was. And some of the people would go on and on. The people would go on and on. I got deep into their mind of understanding who they were. And I think that's one great thing that photographers don't really talk about, but I think they all experience that in terms of dealing with taking pictures. Abstract or people, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's a tough act to follow there, Adra. You've summed up so much so beautifully, and we are so grateful for your insights, and our audience giving us.
If it hadn't been for you and Alex and everybody, Izzy, you know, Nell, if Nell had not given the pictures, there would be none of this. So I have to take my hat off to all of you. This is very, very beautiful. And this is something that's going to go on for quite some time, even after the show. Because to inspire a new generation to begin to understand how they can get out of where they are by doing something with that energy. I think it's the big secret.
Well, I agree that I think it will go on, that your work will continue to inspire people and the work of Kamoinge for a very long time. And I am so grateful that you've shared so generously tonight. And thank you, Erna, and thank you, Sharia. And next week is our final week. Next week we will be hearing from Deborah Willis, and she'll be talking about the importance of mentorship. She'll be talking about Louis Draper's work, but also just kind of the importance of mentorship and what it means for the next generation. And I'm looking forward to that. And I'm so grateful again to our audience. So many of you I have been watching have been tuning in every week, and it has, even though I don't know everybody who's watching, it has started to feel like this larger family that asks such great questions, and that the comments have been so encouraging, and we are so grateful for you that are watching. And thank you very much to all of you.
Oh, thank you all.
And thank you, Adger, Erna, and Sharia. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, see everyone next week.
Okay.